Hello and welcome to another process walkthrough video. As always with these type of videos, we'll go through the Photoshop files for each of the works posted this month, and we'll talk about what kind of thought process goes into it, as well as pretty much just break down, have organic talk, an explanation about how they come together. So unfortunately this month we only have 4 pieces for this video, with another one that will be thoroughly talked about in the tutorial, so it will not be here. And without further ado, let's get to talking about this first piece over here. So with this piece here, there's a bit of a chance to talk about rarely touch on topic, and that is how to essentially salvage a piece where you feel like you still like a good amount of the features and a lot of the groundwork you laid down, but you feel like there are significant areas of the drawing where you did not execute the drafting process well. And so this is a piece that I essentially did not quite have a good starting process with. So I ended up with a post that I actually didn't really think about enough when I began, and I had to essentially adapt it on the go. And this is how things happen. Right, I will not unfortunately be going through every single layer of progress because this is actually the second take, to be honest, and the first take felt really dragged on because I went through every single layer. So we'll just go through a couple layers at a time to talk about how things change from step to step, essentially. Right, so in the beginning, this is sort of the sketch that I end up with, and I felt, the gesture isn't quite right, and I didn't like how, quote unquote, shy the character looked in this sort of pose, because it's meant to be a companion piece to this one. So again, right, changes were needed, and this is how I kind of adapted towards it. Right, immediately I sort of tried out, okay, let's open up the shoulders a bit and have the character standing a bit more relaxed, right? One hand up and one hand down. Unfortunately, that still didn't feel quite right. So again, we continue trying out stuff, like for example, this shot here, right? It's a bit flipped, and you have to excuse me, as you know, sometimes as we go through the process, we'll find a couple of flip layers. Right, so again, the next step is to try something a bit different. So for example, we have the other arm essentially folded in, essentially like folded arms with one hand reaching up to the face. So I figured out that, okay, this is not a bad position to be in. But as you can see, I still have problems with how to position the gesture of the shoulders and how to adapt it. Right, so a couple more iterations later, things are a little bit better, so I felt like, okay, it's time to try out some lighting, try out a bit of skin tone to see how things fit on. And then after this part, where I can essentially tell that, okay, it's not too horrible and we can still try and fix it, rather than just completely restart, I just continue painting, right? Things like zooming out to draw more of the silhouette if you feel like or rather more of the character if you feel like the composition is a bit too restricted. Right, for example, the character shoulder here, I want them to be a bit broader, but in the previous close-up shot, it was a bit difficult for me to do. Right, so this is what I did, and at the same time, sort of broadening out the shoulders and correcting the gesture to what I want. Right, and essentially I continue the process, just very roughly painting without, worrying too much about the small details, and essentially just moving along and continuously making rough but important changes to the picture to see how it goes. So at this stage, it looks like the overall idea is more sound and doable, so I test out some color schemes, which are also quite important, especially when the drawing itself, I feel, is a bit more static. I think having an interesting color scheme helps mitigate that quietness a bit. Right, so continue painting, lightening up the foreground of the character a bit more. Right, introducing a bit more blue to the areas in shadow with this sort of soft light layer. Really, personally, I just use a normal soft light multiply and really just very few of the layers here to achieve the effects that I want. And then we just continue painting using more selective color layers to adjust respectively the red and the blues. And then when I feel like the drawing is suitable, or rather sort of workable, right, I can paint in a couple more details like the character's eyes, right, and we can work on things like the hair a bit more. And then we can use another hue saturation layer to sort of see, okay, so the blues are a bit too strong, let's try a lighter tone blue, right, and all these kind of things here. Right, so this is how the sketch ended up as at the point where I realized, okay, so this is a workable composition, the pose is salvageable, and then we are mostly out of the woods. So to do a small recap up to this part, right, the main idea is, for me personally, when encountering a drawing which I feel is not really going well early on, is to, instead of spending a lot of time to reset the whole thing, which may be helpful sometimes, right? But for me, myself, I find that it's usually more convenient and easier on morale to just continue painting in roughly and correct the gesture from there on. After which you can try adding color and a couple of simple details if you feel like the drawing is going in the right direction. So let's proceed on to the next file here, right? So again, this is where we left off in the previous Photoshop file. Again, for people who are new to my videos and my workflow, generally I use Photoshop files as like a series of save states, and I'm very casual with the layers because I really just hate fiddling around with layers, like going back and forth to find, okay, which part is this on, which layer is this on. I really don't like that, so I just use it as a save state. So if you're worried about what kind of layering I'm using, or if there are some secret tricks, there are really no tricks when it comes to me using layers. It's really simple. So again, we'll repeat the same thing as we did before, just go through things quickly, adjusting some proportions, right? And then just kind of continuing on with the painting the character, like lowering this arm and drawing back the sleeve to show more of the wrist, right? Testing if having the light strike the other side of the arm a bit harder is working. Actually, there's some bit on here, and actually, pardon the constant back and forth flipping, right? Again, it's a common thing that I'm sure you've heard of. It's good to flip your drawing horizontally once in a while to help check that you did not forget some important things which, you know, you may have missed by staying in like one view of it for too long. Right, so from here on out, the crux of the composition is largely settled, and I can worry a bit more about the background, which in this case we are synchronizing up with this piece here. So we notice that there's a lot of bright light reflecting off the floor, and then we can reflect that in this piece here as well. Right, and then basically just continue painting, adding in things like these glasses here. I think that there's one layer that I merged, so it looks a bit awkward without this layer. But this is generally how I just keep painting. Right, and then we try out ideas like having these side bangs add a bit more dynamic energy, and sort of adjusting them back and forth to see how they work. Right, so this is a position where I think, hey, you know, this pose looks quite good. Right, we can have like the character wearing this sort of like a woolen sweater, and then have like a suit outside, and then the hair, the size of the side bangs and the fingers, then the positioning of the hand, and all those are working out well. So essentially from here on out, it's just a couple of small changes, and then we can wrap up. And that is pretty much how this particular piece goes. Right, again, you can see a couple of back and forth changes in the positioning of the arm, very small, really just as sort of like a personal pet peeve to kind of get it as right as I can get it, right? Because in reality, the impression that it gives is largely the same. But I think it's always good to think about things a bit more and try our best to make them the best they can be. And then finally is the final result. And I won't go through these last few layers because the changes are very minor. I don't want to waste everybody's time. But this is pretty much the final result. We just add on like a rain layer onto what we're working with, and then we can call it a day. Now let's move on to the next piece. So with this piece here, referring to the sketch in the middle, you can see that it is actually initially intended to be a companion piece to this drawing here on the left. Now for various reasons, as I will explain, as I painted and worked on it, it ended up looking like this image here on the right instead, right? In a sort of a different scene, which I think is actually a bit more interesting in terms of composition, but a bit less interesting in terms of sheer detail and variety of detail. So let's explain how we got from the sketch to this final result here. So to begin with, in the sketch stage, I made a lot of reference to this previous piece here to sort of find out how the scene is laid out, as well as using photo reference here of this particular photograph, this stock photo, because we're drawing sort of like an angle I'm not too familiar with, and sure, I could use some of my fundamental skills to figure out most of how the pose should go, right? But I think having this kind of reference on hand really helps with nuances that you don't really, essentially have on hand at every single moment, right? So again, this is another reminder that if you're attempting a difficult pose, you're attempting like a difficult angle, always try your best to find some reference to help yourself and guide yourself along, because the reference is going to remind you of a lot of things that you will otherwise pretty much forget. And even if you remember them, right, the reference can provide a higher fidelity understanding of it, or give you a higher fidelity understanding of the structures and volumes, so you can draw them better as well. So again, always use reference when possible. Right, so the sketch here is quite interesting, I think, in terms of the amount of variety and detail of the scene, right? We have like this lower area here, like the road here, or the back alley here, where there's a bike, and where there's a guy knocked out on the hood of the car, and a lot of areas to add in small detail. But my issue with the scene was that it was a bit too constrained by the previous piece. And as a result, it was a bit difficult to essentially add red lighting in, as prominently as the previous piece. It was a bit hard to figure out where to position the knocked out people, because the current, how do I put it? It was really difficult to sort of showcase the scene that I wanted. Right, as you can see here in the final result, it was difficult to showcase this scene with this particular physical layout as before. So after a bit of sketching and a bit of messing around with color, and I do apologize that I have essentially lost a couple of Photoshop files in between, so there will be a bit of a jump, but I can assure you that I will still cover all the important things that went on. So let's put this down and then essentially jump here. Now, as you can see, if anything, the image on the right initially looks a bit worse, but a bit cleaner in composition than the one on the left here. Right, so on the right here, I decided, okay, we'll have the red light come in from ground reflection to introduce the red element into the piece, and then we will still have this like sort of direct spotlight style of lighting coming from the rear of the character that is, and that's our bottom left on the canvas. So in terms of grand composition or overarching composition, it's still quite similar, but I've taken the chance to essentially help balance things out a bit in terms of giving myself more space to position, details, and how do I put it? Position myself in a place where I can work with adding things onto the scene more easily, right? As compared to the sketch where a lot of things were constrained. So progressing from there on, let me flip that back. Right, so progressing from here on, right, I decided, okay, so now the character is like in the middle of a road. So if we want to add some recurring patterns to kind of reinforce the concept, we can try something like a zebra crossing, right? And then add in like the shadows to it, right? Essentially very roughly block in the aftermath of a fight to see how it looks in terms of the big picture. right? And then using like a selective color to tune back the very strong blues a little bit. And then here is where I thought, okay, the character looks a bit too weird in this angle, so I might have missed something in terms of my perspective and how to light, and I wanted to reline up the character, right? So again, this is a great moment to pull out the reference, sort of check what you need to check, sort of look at how the gesture and how the like skeletal structure flows, if that makes sense, and then kind of readjust yourself based on that. So of course it's not like an exact one-to-one because my camera positioning is a bit different from this particular photo here, right? But what I'm mainly capturing is the sort of gesture of the character or the person, right, as they stand in this sort of pose from this kind of angle. So in this layer, I know you can notice that I more quote-unquote strictly painted in the perspective because it's a big part of the piece, right? And then use this particular curves layer here to sort of tune the lighting, and then continually make lighting adjustments, essentially playing around with seeing what works and what doesn't. And then when I felt like the red in here was conflicting a bit too strongly with the lighting from the bottom right here, you can see what changes I made, right? By sort of restricting the red to this upper corner here. And the logic for that is that when you have very irregular surfaces, they don't usually give a mirror style reflection effect. So for example, I can justify that this area on top here is like a water puddle, and the bottom area here is like slightly drier. So we can justify why it's not reflecting much red, while the area here is reflecting a lot more red. Right, and then this is sort of it being more realized, and the colors on the brightness is also being a bit more toned back. Right, so you can see the mix of puddles and as well as proximity allows this area up top here to be brighter in terms of the influence of red color. And all this while I'm using a perspective grid, as you can see from the sketch stage. And the perspective grid not only helps us line up the character or the zebra crossing, it also helps line up like this building in the reflection. We can follow the red lines here and draw them in as well. Right, and continuing with this particular piece, again, very minor adjustments, adding in like fallen villains, I guess, fallen victims of the character. Right, as you can see, I have duplicates of this particular layer here. Every time I want to make very so-called destructive changes, I duplicate the layer once and then just paint it again. Right, going from there on. Right, and then you can see that I tuned back the darkest value range a bit to concentrate it, and then just continue painting. So from here on out, again, there was not going to be too many changes other than adjusting like the colors, adjusting the tones, doing very minor adjustments like this, where I realized, okay, this person here doesn't fit the composition, so let's get rid of them. And then yeah, really smaller stuff like that, just continually adding on. As you can see, sometimes I try color changes like this that just don't stick, which is totally fine. Yeah, and adding a bit more reflection to the zebra crossing paint, which I think I did not keep the effect of. Okay, you can see here another wild attempt at seeing how different colors fit. And then this is pretty much mostly how the piece went. A lot of small changes once the big composition is settled in on. And for this piece, I would say one of the hardest parts is to figure out the angle itself, right? And what I found helped a lot was using the perspective grid to sort of fix in the zebra crossing, because they are a nice anchor point for visual reference, and for me it sort of helps to have that so I can draw the rest of the scene more confidently. Still, overall, I think there are a couple of areas of improvement, and in terms of perspective, that I'm still a bit hazy with when I painted this, but overall I think it is not too bad an attempt, and it's good experience for next time as well. So for this last part here, right, we added in some blood effects flowing into the drain, just the usual stuff to make the scene a bit spicier. And here's pretty interesting. We have like some footprints for the character to walk into this current position, which I didn't really think of until pretty close to the end, as you can see, because you know, like, it just felt odd that there's more of this action going on and then the character is just quietly standing here. So I thought having some footprints would be nice to show that they essentially walk through this, you know, nasty blood, and then it's like standing here. Right, and then we can do things with more curves layer to sort of brighten up the entire scene if needed, and then adding more blood effects if needed as well. And with this should pretty much be the end of the process for this piece. And for the very final part, as you can see, I made some color adjustments, tuning back the blues a little bit, and then focusing, excuse the silly error. Let me just start a new way here. Right, so as you can see, for the very last part, I adjust basically what happened was that we adjusted the colors to tune back the blues a bit, which I think it's an okay decision, but I think the blues are kind of nice in their own way. But this is what we end up with, a bit more of a muted piece in terms of more grayish and then reddish, right? Compared to the piece on the left, which is more bluish plus reddish. And I think each has its own strengths, but I think I like both of them a little bit, almost equally in terms of color scheme. But yeah, this is pretty much it for this particular piece. And again, as a light recap, I think I've already done the recap once already, but the idea is to really just, again, use reference to help yourself figure out difficult poses, and in terms of difficult angles, just try to just spend a bit more energy if you can to think about things like reflections, how and why you can restrict compositional elements like, you know, large blocks of red color, how to sort of position your lighting, and how the shadows cast. So yeah, this is the process for this piece over here. Moving on to this next piece. For this piece, because it's kind of like a silhouette based piece in terms of concept, as you can see here, it ended up really close to the final result. Because of that, I can actually afford to take a more rough approach to it. I can just paint in the silhouettes of the character and the cat and like essentially sketch in the background quite quickly. Because of the nature of this silhouette type of feel to this image and composition, I didn't really have to draw in all the line sketch for everything in high detail, right? So this is how I began the scene, which is always a nice way to kickstart the scene and to help speed things along whenever it's appropriate, right? So moving on from here, I use a little bit of photo bashing to add some textures. I find it really helpful because sometimes when you have a complicated scene like this, and especially if there are some textures that need to be in the foreground, it's good to have a placeholder that we can have at the beginning for a little bit, and then we can replace later, right? As you can see here, towards the end, right, it all gets replaced with our own brushed on texture and like painted rocks. So for the beginning part, we use this simple placeholder for a bit as we start figuring out the rest of the composition. Right, like what kind of details do we add, what kind of color balance should we try to achieve, what kind of variety in color do we want, and how suppressed or how vibrant they need to be. So again, reference helps us very much with all these. As you can see here on the left here, I made good use of these references to help me sort of paint the scene almost accurately in a sense, even though it's quite stylized and very roughly done even in the final product. Right, so we did a bit of scaling here to sort of adjust the camera angle. Yeah, and as I said, the process is really quite straightforward compared to the previous two, so it's just a matter of just keep adjusting the piece almost and adding things that you want to see. Right, for example, sometimes when you are feeling a bit overwhelmed, like in this case, I was really overwhelmed by the amount of things that needed to add. So in that case, I would just say to lock onto a few of the most prominent items. Like in this case, we have like these shelves here, which is one of the immediate things they'll notice when you look at this, right? There are shelves, and there are like there are a bunch of legs on the shelves and a lot of like crisscross racks. So that's the kind of thing that I captured here, and I think it works quite nicely. So yeah, there's no need to overcomplicate things and try to draw every single thing. And in fact, I'm personally also too lazy to do that as well. So it kind of sort of forces me into this mode where I try to capture the gist of things, right? And then, as you can see here, when the image is feeling a bit too 2D, I use a bit of a multiply layer here, I believe. Use a multiply layer to add in a bit of dark occlusion where light doesn't reach as much, right? And just continue painting from there on. As we add more and more detail, we can go towards the finished state of the piece. And at this point in time, right, as you have said before, the placeholder has served its purpose and it's time for us to account for it fully. Right, you can paint in this screen cover here with, you know, this manually textured background, or rather foreground, excuse me. And then yeah, from here on out, it's just a couple of minor adjustments, and then with a couple of little bit of tweaks here and there, add a bit of grass in the foreground, and paint in these brush strokes to sort of create some volume. And yeah, that's it for this piece. Moving on to the final piece and my favorite for this month, let's take a look at how this was made. So let's begin with the sketch here. So for this piece, as I've said before, I like to usually start with this traditional black line on white background sketch. I think this is a really good way to start drawings because it's the simplest. You don't get tied down by a lot of different things. You basically just have essentially two values to work with. Now, obviously, since I did not quite intend for this to be like a, you know, silhouette-based piece like the previous one, the option of just, you know, blocking in things roughly is less feasible in this particular case. Right. So once we've set up this sort of simple sketch, the next step is to start adding in some color, or rather some values, right? So let's take a look at how I do them for this particular piece. So give me a moment as I find my sketch layer. Yeah, so to begin with, I add in this particular layer here. Now, as you can see here, excluding the dark hair that I just painted in very casually, the whole point of this layer is to simply describe the top-down lighting. So for this particular piece, I intended for it to have a very strong top-down lighting, like in the character standing in a lift. So that's the very first thing I decided to go for. Right, and once that's done, we can consider adding in a bit more local color. For example, in this case, and reflection as well, right? So we have like the dark suit, the dark shirt, and the like blue pants of the character being taken into account as well. And then we layer on this a bit more of this casual and looser painting style to essentially do two things at once. So firstly, all right, to create that bit of a relationship between like the source of light being on up high versus down versus fading out down low. So the walls near the bottom of the elevator are a bit darker as well. And at the same time, right, this also does a bit of texture work for me as well. Very rough texture work, but it's sort of like, again, enough for me to visualize what the scene might feel like if I have like a quote-unquote noisy sort of wall design, right? I have a bit of noise, have a bit of texture in the wall, and what that will look like. And then going on from there, I use a bit of I add on a bit more line work to sort of reinforce the key perspective points. As you can see here, I always have like this handy perspective grid set up every time I want to start a new scene. It helps a lot. And then I just simply follow that, reinforce some of the volumes in the lift itself. And then here I make a bit of adjustment to the overall composition. So I felt like there's a bit too much noise near the bottom area with all the people in the background behind the character. Of course, I think there are ways to make that work as well, but in this case I felt that it made the scene a bit too noisy, so I tuned it back a little bit with this layer here. Right, and then I just continue painting and adding on textures. So this is a this is the next sort of big change, which is where I decided to give the character a jacket. So before this, it really looked a bit too simple almost, the character's costume. So I think to spice it up a bit and make things a bit more interesting, both in terms of the design itself and in terms of increasing the complexity to make the piece as a composition more interesting, I added this like jacket. And then on the same layer, right, I worked with a couple of like ideas. So for example, the knocked out guy will have like red flowers blooming from his face instead of blood. So I tried out the idea, and it didn't really work in this particular setting because it felt like it was a bit contrasting a bit too hard with the character. So for the moment, I shelved this idea, right, and I just continue on. So I continue adjusting like the perspective and the pose of the guy on the floor, and I spent an inordinate or disproportionate amount of time on that. So just basically working on that and dealing with small nuances in this phase of the drawing, right? And I decided to have the guy face down because I think that takes away less attention from the character, because now we have like two faces and it's a bit of contrast that I don't quite want. So essentially flip the guy on the floor over and then like remove the other guy because I felt like it was getting a bit too crowded. So and it was difficult to fit him in like just physically, right? The lift doesn't have quite that much space. So again, these adjustments are all down on the fly. There's no like rule book telling me, you know, what exactly to do or to choose. Right? Again, you can see I just keep experimenting, and then eventually we can move on to the next Photoshop file. Right, and so give me a moment. So this is where we left off just a couple of seconds ago, right? And then as we build on, apologies again, give me a moment. Right, so at this point in time I decided, okay, I'm gonna settle it with the guy lying face down with his hand kind of like clawing at the door of the elevator. So at this point in time I felt comfortable to throw in some color as well. So a bit of nice soft light layer, with my favorite for adding color, to add some skin tone, the jeans, the shirt, and the jacket. And then I decided to add a bit of yellow, since sometimes this kind of lifts or elevators have this linoleum type thing, and it's a bit yellowish from either grime or just its base color. So I decided to add that and a bit of it reflecting off the walls. And then use a bit of selective color to tune that in a bit more. And then once that's done, I did a small bit of sketching to like add in a rough design to sort of test how it will work for the shirt to have this to have a design, right? As well as to essentially paint in the face of the character a little bit as well, right? From super rough to, you know, a tiny bit cleaner. Right, and then I realized, okay, this character is dressed casually, but she also has like this jade bracelet, so I decided to throw that in as well. Plus, it's a nice dash of extra color to accentuate the scene as well. So yeah, it's a win-win. Yeah, and then moving on, I just continue adjusting the character's top, and then here I make a couple of bigger adjustments, trying to add more color to the scene, because at this point in time I think I felt that the scene was way too dull, like it was too serious, right? Because you have this character here that's dressed very vibrantly in terms of the jacket and like the way she's posing. It looks like a very vibrant pose, but otherwise, you know, the elevator or the interior of the lift is really quiet in terms of color, right? So I try adding some color to, say, the posters on the wall, and then I try a selective color again. So sometimes the reason of the scene feeling a bit too bland is not really because how do I put it? It is not really because you lack elements entirely. Sometimes it's just because you just lack color in general, because the lift's walls are usually made of steel or aluminum, that kind of material. So sometimes it ends up very gray. So to resolve that, I like to use selective color layers. again, my favorite when it comes to throwing in large patches of color, right? So we make it a bit green and all that. You know, here's to check out my adjustments: neutrals, whites, black, reds. Yeah. So just to make some adjustments so I can start working with color overall. And I also find it like a good idea to start introducing your general mood colors with things like selective color layer as you add your local colors, because ultimately they're going to work fairly closely together, especially in a scene where like the overall color composition is important, right? Because if I was drawing just this character by herself, like in a very zoomed in shot, I would say that it matters a bit less, because we can justify that the focus is completely on the character and the background is just there to support. But in this case, they're almost equally important. So yeah, that's why I think it's pretty important to get your mood color in somewhat early. And especially so if you're feeling like the drawing is a bit too dull. But once that's done, I decided, okay, let's try making the floor also a bit brighter, like a more orange compared to this dull yellow. And then yeah, just continue adding and painting in details. You can see here, like make an adjustment to the blue of the jeans, from this like purplish blue to this very cyan blue, right? Same thing, I started figuring out and thinking about using fast food as like a decoration or a theme. And then yeah. So at this point in the drawing, this is pretty close to where we left off, with one major difference, right? Unfortunately, let me see if I can find it. I believe it's here, or somewhere around here. My apologies. I always get quite disorganized and sometimes things get super messy. So again, like I'm like retracing my footsteps in this new file. Yeah. Okay, so here's where a lot of the big changes start to happen. So here's a lot where a lot of the big changes start to happen. Again, apologies for the kind of fiddling around. So previously we had this sort of scene, and now we are here. So what happened here is that I decided to transform the door of that's behind the character into like a window or something more interesting, right? So here you can see me trying out a railing in the back and like a bulletin board. Now the issue with this is that unfortunately this doesn't show the door of the lift, which kind of removes the kind of visual cue that tells us that the character's in a lift or elevator, which is what we want, right? So that's the issue here. In order to remedy this, right, we have two options. One, we can revert back to the door, which is difficult because usually there's almost never anything on the door itself, so it's hard to decorate the background behind the character. Sure, you can put some graffiti or something, but it's weird because, like, you know, when a door opens and closes, it gets brushed away and all that stuff, right? So another option that I went for is to change it into this window. Like, we know that some lifts have like glass windows, and then I think this could be like a doubly cool scene where we can show the city in the background, we can show a bit of reflection, we can also use this like dark glass value to sort of not silhouette our character so strongly, right? So here's what I mean. So previously you can see our character is silhouetted very obviously against the backdrop, which has its own purposes, right? But here I want the character to blend a bit more into the background a little bit as well, because I don't want, how do I put it? I think sometimes there's merit to having the shapes of the character blend a bit closely into the background, especially when you're drawing a scene that's slightly more chaotic. So you do not want things to be too well blended together. So in this case, I think it's a nice compromise to have like this dark background that's behind the character. Right, and now moving on to our final Photoshop file, which is going to be quite a doozy. So this is where we were. We have this glass here with like a bunch of red stuff on the ground. And then let's go on from here. So here I did a sort of like a hard reset on the clothing. So I was like, okay, I need to paint this properly, right? So I started painting the clothing, the pants, the fabric, and the forms. So at this point I realized, okay, the black shirt is a bit too bright. It's looking like this green shirt that's too close to the color of the elevator wall. So dropped it down a notch and then continued painting the forms. Yeah, and then I searched up a couple of references for shirt design, and I was like, okay, this one's pretty cool. It's a nice match of colors, and I just, manually drew it in. As you can see, the line work is pretty rough, but I think from a distance, or rather from like this current zoom, it looks perfectly fine, and I like the color combo, so I stuck with it. Yeah, and then adjusting the pose and the lighting on the forehead a bit. Right, notice how in this case, the lighting on the nose is really bright, but the forehead is really dark. That doesn't make much sense because there's nothing really obscuring it as the hair is stuck. As the hair sticks pretty close to the forehead, so yeah, brightening it up really just pushes the character and the piece in general towards completion. So really a lot of the thing is, as I always say, a lot of like rectifying small errors as you move along, as you just go towards completion. Right, now this part is where I had a bit of trouble with the character's knees. So anatomy is definitely not my strong suit. I think I work it passably, but sometimes I also struggle with it a bit, right? So for example here, I felt like the character's legs don't look natural enough, even though generally they follow like the silhouette of some references I found. So I decided to trying to inject some nuance into it, right? So in this case, right, I noticed that, for example, there's the separation between like the quadriceps and the knee, or the patella part of the knee, and the shin itself is quite obvious, especially from a higher angle. So I decided to sort of emphasize that separation, right, and then just make adjustments based on it and then cleaning it up, right? So I realized that, okay, so this actually works quite well. And this was actually one of the headaches I had with the drawing. So at this point in time, I was really glad I was done with that part. And so the next part, I started cleaning up the background, adding in some reflections of relevant reflections. Yeah, and then really just continue painting and rinse and repeat. And then we just add in a bit more, basically just clean up brush strokes, right? So far, no details on the walls or the guy on the floor yet. We've mainly been focusing on the character and getting the big forms correct, right? Notice how the boots are sort of in place, but still mainly I'm focused on the big form and where the cast shadows lie. So for example, this part of the boot is in shadow, so yeah, it stays in shadow, and this part's in light, so we deal with the highlights and all the midtones and stuff. So far, still just a lot of the big picture stuff, plus a bit of detail on like the main focus of the character. And then here's where I experiment with adding a bit like a graffiti in the background, adjusting the highlights on the jacket, improving the shape of the jacket. Again, these things are often when you see that I sort of like, oh, suddenly it looks more realistic. I don't just pull that out of thin air. Oftentimes I feel like, okay, I need a bit more detail here and there, so I just go and search up some references and then apply them. Right, continuing on, I start working in the details for the other parts of the set as well, or the other parts of the scene, like these tissue papers on the floor, right? Previously they weren't there. I thought, hey, the floor's looking a bit too quiet, so let's throw in a couple of different values, like this white here to match with the orange and red, and this dark green. Yeah, and from here on, it's really just adjusting colors, adding more details. Yeah, and then like for example, to capture the material of like this ketchup, this mystery sauce here, right? For example, we have, because ketchup is sort of like a especially if it's like in blobs, right? You have like this very obvious volume to it compared to just like a flat surface of like a stain, right? So to capture the volume of it, like you can have some shadows, have a bit of highlights, right? Like just a couple of highlights here scattered throughout just makes it look really volumetric. And just throwing a ketchup bottle here, and then also like this crushed drink cup, excuse me, here, and then painting the poster with like a character. Yeah, so small details, and I throw in the fries again, right? The sort of theme behind this painting is to make things a bit more colorful, so to introduce another color here in like the yellow fries is really nice. And yeah, just some another selected color to boost out the reds to make things a bit more attractive. And then yeah, we're getting pretty close to wrap up. And here I draw in the buttons manually and then put them in here. I think with these pieces where there's a lot of detail, it can pay off to draw the small ones like buttons properly, right? Because kind of where this is the part where people will look for actual detail. Whereas everything else like scratches and stuff, you can usually get away with it. So again, more detail on the character like the belt. A couple of toothbrush, like a toothbrush spray effect on the walls with like a particle brush, and then add in the lights in the city in the background. Again, right, we use the perspective grid to help us line up these lights so they go on much easier than before. And yeah, that's pretty much it. Again, just really minor changes here all the way until the very end where we added some extra fries here. Lit up a 13th floor here, and then gave the character a pair of yellow shades. And that will be it for this piece. So this was a bit of a long video, and I hope you found it helpful as always. Thank you for your support a lot here on Patreon. I appreciate it a lot, and next month there will be quite an interesting set that I'm working on, so please do look forward to that, and I hope to see you again.